what we're in for looks like a global financial crisis and a global recession at the same time. The recession is going to be very severe. The global financial crisis is coming. I always tell people, if you want to forecast the Fed, don't use common sense, use what they use. Their models are flawed. Their methodology is very poor. They use models that don't even exist. They exist, but they don't tell you anything, like the Phillips curve. But you have to know all that, and you have to use it, because if that's what they're using, then you have to understand it in order to forecast the Fed. It doesn't mean they're right. In fact, they're usually wrong, and it doesn't mean you should do that in your own forecasting, but you do need to do it to understand the Federal Reserve policy. So what the Fed has is something called a terminal rate. What's the terminal rate? And by the way, I mentioned that August 26th speech that Powell gave. He gave another speech on September 21st at a press conference after the FOMC meeting on that day. And if I had to summarize what he said then, he said, for those of you who were not listening to my Jackson Hole speech, let me tell you again what we're going to do. We're going to cause a recession. We're going to raise unemployment. He didn't say it in so many words, but that was a clear important intent of what he was saying. By the way, the Jackson Hole speech, he used the word pain, economic pain, 3 times in one paragraph. I've been following the Fed for 45 years. I've never heard a Fed chairman use the word pain at all. And he does it 3 times in one paragraph just to make a point. So he says it on September 21st, and then does it again on November 2nd. November 2nd was another FOMC meeting. As I said, they're about 6 weeks apart. Comes out in the press conference and is even more blunt. And I fully expect, I'm almost certain, give his 4th warning. Hey, we're heading into a recession. We're going to do what it takes. So I mentioned the terminal rate. So what is the terminal rate? Quantitatively, no one knows. And Jay Powell does. I don't know. Jay Powell doesn't know. But the definition would be it's when the rate is high enough that inflation will come down on its own, just because of the high rate. And it doesn't have to be higher than inflation. Some people say, well, if inflation is 7%, doesn't that mean the rate has to be 8%? Not necessarily. If inflation is 7%, it may be the case that a 5% policy rate is high enough to cause the 7 to go down eventually to 2. So again, it doesn't have to be higher than inflation, but it has to be high enough to cause inflation to come down on its own without further rate hikes. And that they call it the terminal rate because they say when we get there, we won't have to raise rates anymore. We'll just sit there through a period that they've already called the pause. And then the pause will just be however long it takes for inflation to come down on its own, down to 2%. Now, a couple of things about that. I said no one knows where it is. Well, right now the policy rate's 4.25%, and there's a little bit of market euphoria around this. It's like you're getting ready to cut rates. Well, no, they're not getting anywhere close to cutting rates. They're not even going to reduce by a small amount. What Powell said in November, he said it's not that we're going to cut rates. We might raise them by a smaller amount, but we might do more of them. February, March. We have the 2023 calendar, by the way. It's not secret. You can go to the Fed website and look it up. We might just keep doing it longer than you think until we get to this terminal rate. So let's just say another 50 on February 1st. Now you're at 5.25. Is that the terminal rate? It could be. We have to see the data. As I said, Powell doesn't know, and I certainly don't. It could be, or maybe not. Maybe the inflation persists for reasons that no one quite foresees. And if it does, they'll raise them again in March. And keep going. So the terminal rate could be quite high. And here's the other key point for the market, stock market cheerleaders, I call them. Powell said when we get there, when we get to what they judge to be the terminal rate, they're going to sit tight for an indefinite period, but they've hinted that it could be a year. I mean, we could be now looking at early 2024, mid 2024, before they ever cut rates, if they do. And because remember, it takes time. The pause will be, okay, we've reached the terminal rate, we believe. Inflation is coming down, but it doesn't come down all at once. We got to wait for that and to get down to 2%. So the pause could be a very long wait. So this is one of the kind of mystifying points about the U.S. stock market. I mean, it seems straightforward to me, but market has their own dynamic. They're saying, well, if the Fed raises rates the way I've described and they cause a recession, the Fed's going to have to cut rates. That's called the pivot, the Fed pivot, and lower rates are good for tech stocks, so buy stocks. That's Wall Street. Of course, they're all salesmen. They don't do very good analysis, but they're very good at selling stuff, and that's kind of their job. So supply chains are breaking down. Costs are going up because of it. The reaction, the Fed's trying to raise interest rates. The Fed can't control the supply side. That's the point, or one of the points. The Fed doesn't drive tractors. They don't plant crops. They don't drill for oil. They don't pump natural gas. They don't drive cargo vessels. They don't do any of the things you need to do more efficiently to lower costs. All they can do is destroy demand. But if inflation were coming from the demand side, which it's not, destroying demand might work. But for inflation to come from the supply side, which it is, how much demand destruction do you have to do to affect the supply side? The answer is a lot. That's, again, part of the reason I expect a very severe recession in the United States. It's a consequence of the supply chain breakdown. What we're in for looks like a global financial crisis and a global recession at the same time, coming sooner than later. Now, why do I say that? There's a global dollar shortage. Now you have to look behind the curtain, not to get too in the weeds, but you got to go behind the curtain of the international monetary system and understand what's there. The international monetary system is not driven by a central bank. Sorry, Reserve Bank. Sorry, Fed. You're not in charge. The parties who are in charge are the euro dollar banks. When the Fed prints money, yeah, they print it $9 trillion, but they do it by buying bonds from the banks, and the banks take the money and give it back to the Fed. That money doesn't go anywhere; it just sits on the Fed balance sheet. The money that can drive an economy comes from lending and basically checking accounts, where a bank will make you a loan, put the money in your checking account, and you go spend it. That can get some economic growth going. So, but the Eurodollar market are the major banks transacting primarily in dollars, but it can be foreign currencies from time to time, outside of any regulatory scheme, outside of anything the Fed sees, outside of what the Bank of England sees, et cetera. It's there, it's big, but it's amazing how little central banks understand about the Eurodollar system. Now, here's the point. There's a global dollar shortage, and people go, wait a second. The Fed printed $9 trillion, which they did in 2020. It's come down since then, but they did print that much money. How could there be a global dollar shortage? Well, what people don't understand is that behind the curtain, off balance sheet, this is off balance sheet. You got to go read the footnotes and understand what you're reading. There are $1 quadrillion of derivatives, and they have to be supported with collateral. And the collateral is not 100%, not even 10%. I mean, kind of 1% or 2% is enough. But when you're in a liquidity crisis, banks are extremely choosy about which collateral they'll accept to support this quadrillion-dollar inverted pyramid of derivatives. And right now, what they're saying, because this evolves, it gets worse. It doesn't happen overnight. It can become acute overnight, but it happens over the course of a year or longer. What we see, the banks are saying, I don't want corporate bonds as collateral. I don't want your mortgages as collateral. I don't even want 10-year Treasury notes as collateral. The only collateral I want are short-term U.S. Treasury bills. Treasury bills have a maximum maturity of 1 year, 360 days, but there can be 4-week bills, 8-week bills, 6-month bills, et cetera. That's the best form of collateral. It's the most liquid, easily traded, low volatility, easy to repledge. Is by far the best form of collateral. That's all the banks want right now.